Your session in here is Preserving the Alamo Today, a panel on historic preservation at the Alamo. Oh, wait. Okay, there I am. This session is sponsored by the Texas State Genealogical Society, and I will introduce each speaker as they come up, and please keep the questions till the end. I'm assuming they'll be very overlapping, so one of our three experts can probably help you at the end. Our first speaker is Kim. Okay. Kim Barker, Preservation Planner and Project Manager at the GLO. Kim manages preservation and deferred maintenance of the Alamo Complex for the General Land Office, a position she has held since 2013, and serves on the Management Committee for the Alamo Master Plan. Kim previously worked at the Texas Historical Commission and has a master's degree in historic preservation, and she's got some great information to convey. Please help me in welcoming Kim Barker.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Okay, good. It's working. This is what we think about when we think about the Alamo, but this building represents a relatively small portion of the original mission, a small portion of the 1836 battle, and a small portion of the current Alamo Complex. We now refer to this building as the church, and a small portion of it was used for church services during the mission period. In this talk, I'll give you a very, very brief history of the development of the Alamo Complex as we know it today for the purpose of context, define preservation, and look at the General Land Office's deferred maintenance program and its completed, active, ongoing, and planned projects. And we can talk briefly about the Alamo Master Plan Archaeology at the end of the talk. I may refer to the General Land Office as the GLO, just so you know what I'm saying when I say that. The Alamo Church was constructed as part of Mission San Antonio de Valero. The current Alamo is actually the third site of Mission San Antonio de Valero. It was built here in 1724 by the Spanish missionaries and indigenous people as part of a network of missions. The image at left shows the various sites of Mission San Antonio de Valero. The image at right is a plan of the mission. The red arrows point towards the front of the church to help you get your bearings. The mission was a walled compound where the walls also served as buildings. The long barrack was constructed before the church at this location. Its original use was a convento or priest's residence. 4 other missions were also built in San Antonio, including missions Concepcion, San Juan, San Jose, and Espada. By the late 1700s, the indigenous population had been reduced in part to exposure to new diseases carried by the Europeans, and the San Antonio missions were no longer serving their original purpose. By 1793, Mission San Antonio de Valero was secularized and control passed to local authorities. After secularization, the Spanish military was the first military force to occupy the old mission compound. They converted it into a frontier outpost and military garrison. The first soldiers were La Segunda Compañía Volante, and their occupation gave the Alamo its name, as Dr. Tiarina told us about this morning. In 1836, I'm sure you're aware, the Alamo was host to a pretty important battle. By this time, San Antonio had developed into a significant town and crossroads for commerce. After the battle, many buildings at the Alamo compound were damaged, and the Mexican army was ordered to demolish it before withdrawing that May. They did demolish some of the outer walls. After statehood, the U.S. Army moved into the Alamo and used it as the quartermaster's depot. The image at left shows the church and the long barrack beginning in this period. It was the U.S. Army that roofed the church, likely for the first time, with a gable roof, and built the iconic bell-shaped parapet on the front facade to hide the roof. You can see the Army roof and parapet at the right. After the U.S. Army built Fort Sam Houston and relocated from the Alamo to Fort Sam, the site became commercialized, which is shown at right. During this period, porches and crenellations were added to the long barrack. The Alamo was remembered as an important sacred space after the battle, but it took a while for it to be treated as such. In the meantime, a major city grew around the Alamo, and the only buildings remaining from the mission period became the church and the long barrack, although both had been considerably altered. In 1883, the state purchased the church building from the Catholic Church, who had maintained ownership. This marks the date that the church began to be interpreted for its history. The long barrack, though, was threatened with demolition a few times, including to clear the site for a hotel in 1903. In response, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, a women's lineage organization, purchased the building. 2 years later, the state reimbursed the Daughters, and the Daughters became custodians of both the church and the Long Barrack. The story of the Long Barrack is a lot more complicated and complex, but we'll leave it there for now. Over the first half of the 20th century, additional land was acquired in a park-like setting constructed to the east of the church and the Long Barrack, which you see at right. In 2011, the Texas legislature granted authority over to the Alamo to the Texas General Land Office. The Daughters continued day-to-day operations until last summer when management was shifted over to Alamo Complex management. And this is what we have now as the Alamo Complex to preserve, restore, rehabilitate, and potentially reconstruct. You can see the original mission boundary in red, and the arrows point to the buildings and resources now part of the Alamo Complex, including 3 commercial buildings purchased by GLO last year. Red is for extant or remaining mission and battle period buildings. Blue is historic, meaning over 50 years of age, significant, and with integrity, and purple means non-historic. The Alamo is recognized as historically significant at all possible levels, from local, state, national, and now international. The Alamo, along with the 4 other Spanish colonial missions in San Antonio, were recognized last year by the World Heritage Committee of UNESCO as having worldwide significance for their association with the mission period. World Heritage Sites can be designated for cultural and/or natural history, and this is the first of any type in Texas. The State Antiquities Landmark is the designation that I work more closely with. This is a state-level designation that requires that we apply for permits from the Texas Historical Commission for any work beyond beyond routine maintenance. In order to get a permit, the work has to meet certain standards called the Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties. The treatment standards are divided into 4 different categories or treatment approaches, which are shown here. The term preservation essentially means that you are protecting what's left on the building after decades or centuries of changes and modifications. Rehabilitation means that you're making some compatible changes, typically to accommodate a use that is different than the original use of the building. And folks throw around the term restoration, so I want to be careful about this one. Restoration is returning a resource or building to a particular appearance from a particular point in its history. Restoration has to be consistent. So if you want to return one part of the building to a certain date, like 1836, for example, the standards say that you have to return the whole building to this date. Otherwise, it's very confusing to create an appearance that never existed historically. And this is really tricky with Alamo Church because its roof, parapet, and north wall were modified considerably over time, in addition to the grade being built up around the building. And reconstruction is building something back. In the last legislative session, Commissioner George P. Bush secured $5 million for deferred maintenance needs at the Alamo Complex. I don't expect that you'd be able to read this slide, but I want you to know that a lot of work went into figuring out how best to spend these funds. In order to spend the funds most appropriately, I went through all of the assessments and reports completed on the buildings and grounds over the last approximately 10 years and compiled all reported deficiencies and associated recommendations and surveyed the grounds looking for additional problems. That work resulted in nearly 200 physical recommendations as well as additional visitor use, interpretation, and research recommendations. So for each of those 200 deficiencies, a priority level was assigned, with one being that the problem does not meet code, poses a threat to public safety, or would cause additional substantial harm to the resource if not addressed within 2 years. These are the items that I've been most focused on this year. In some cases, we have also been focused on research and condition assessment projects that will help us make the right choices on how to repair and maintain our significant resources in the near future. Now I'd like to show you some of the GLO projects at the Alamo Complex, all following the standards for the treatment of historic properties. And let's go through them building by building, starting with the church. Before we do, though, I want to note that I'll be referring to the work that we have done. It doesn't mean that I was out there doing all of that work. It's meant to include a bunch of terrific individuals, including architects, engineers, general contractors, masons, and more who have worked on the Alamo Complex under contract with the GLO. And I'll give you some of those names at the end of the presentation. In the fall of 2016, a stone conservator and mason worked on the front facade of the church in response to his previous assessment and recommendations. We were in front of the church for about a month and set up a stone carving workshop on the south side of the building, shown here at the right. This project was intended to improve the facade's ability to shed water, which had been impacted by damage to the water table, cornice, and mortar. The idea was to keep water moving down the facade instead of allowing it to enter the wall, which creates additional damage. We also did a few mock-ups and tests so that we know more about how the building works with different treatments, including cleaning and carving. When the conservator completed an assessment of the facade a couple of years prior, he discovered a loose stone on the cornice and removed it for safekeeping. As part of this project, he returned the stone to the facade and carved a block to hold it. And you can see the carving in progress here with the finished product at right. And you can see how sharp the lines are of the new piece of stone, which accomplishes one of the preservation ethics of differentiating old work from new, but we're not yet at the point of determining whether or not this is the right approach for this building. The carved stone could be removed and altered if determined best, and that's another important thing in preservation, is for something to be removable if necessary. And here's what's called the water table at about waist height, and you can see on the left water could get caught up as it wasn't able to roll off of the building when it rained. We built out the water table on the right, and this area of buildup was left untinted to show the differentiation in materials, but this could be tinted so that it blends in if we decide to do so. We also repointed or remortared the deep joints at the top of the wall. These deep joints were allowing water to enter the wall and become trapped inside. Water is the number one enemy on any historic building, and in the case of the church, we have a falling water problem from rain and a significant rising damp problem from the ground. In fall of 2014, we replaced the roof on the long barrack and cleaned the exterior. Chris Hudson, who you'll hear from next, was the architect on this project. And you can see the before and after of the masonry cleaning here. And we had to be very careful in cleaning historic masonry so that we don't put too much pressure on the walls and too much water inside the walls. And we don't use any chemicals that could damage the stone surface or mortar. Here's the north wall before and after cleaning. We cleaned the north, south, and west walls as part of this project. The east wall facing into the complex remains to be cleaned. And here's the roof. The previous roof was collecting water and buckling. We replaced it with a flat-sloped roof to shed water to the east through new canales or roof drains with larger openings. New electrical and fiber optic lines were run on the roof, elevated to allow water to drain below them. Also part of the project, we had an assessment done of the ceiling beams that are visible on the building interior and found that many were unsound and termite damaged, which you can see in the image on the left. Damaged beams were replaced in kind, which means they were replaced with new beams to match the old, this time treated to prevent termites. In order to achieve the right slope to the new roof drains, we needed to raise the parapet height slightly at the southwest corner of the building, in order to hide the roof from view. And we did this very carefully in close coordination with the Texas Historical Commission. The height was increased by the height of one stone, and Chris and I sat out on the plaza helping the masons select each stone so that it had the best and most inconspicuous appearance. They were very patient with us while we did that. In 2015, a separate project, we stabilized the southwest corner of the long barrack, which was cracking through both stone and mortar joints. To do this, the contractor drilled into the wall, pumped fluid grout into the holes, and inserted stainless steel rods. The rods were cut off within the wall and the holes patched with mortar that matches the historic mortar. This method is referred to as structural stitching. Regarding mortar, we have to be very careful with mortar in historic masonry. Historic buildings were built for the stone to last and the mortar to be sacrificial and require repointing or remortaring every so often. The mortar is soft in this case and the stone hard, but modern mortar is made to be very hard, and when applied to historic masonry, the stone becomes sacrificial to the hard modern mortar instead, which would destroy the building. So we are careful to use the right materials and specialists on these important buildings so as to not cause any damage down the road. The north door to the long barrack, built in the 1960s, was so racked that it no longer closed. And you can see how it caught on the ground in the image on the left. So we replaced the door with a new door to match the old, except for that we put in a kick plate at the bottom and replaced all the glass with safety glass. We also took that opportunity to remove the non-historic security bars from the opening since they were no longer needed. All hardware was made to match the old and a push bar installed for easier egress. And this project was also designed by Chris. In 2014, we restored the windows on the Gift Museum, Alamo Hall, and the Alamo Research Center, the DRT library. The Gift Museum was constructed for the Texas Centennial in the 1930s. Alamo Hall was rehabilitated from a fire station into a meeting hall in the 1930s, and the Research Center was built as a library in 1950. We removed all of the windows on these buildings, stripped them, and reglazed them in the contractor's shop. Windows deteriorated beyond reasonable repair were replaced with reconstructed windows to match the historic. Shown is a window in Alamo Hall that was beyond reasonable repair and so was reconstructed. The window paint colors were sampled by Pam Rosser, who y'all will hear from very soon, and used on the exterior. Last summer, we replaced the porch roof on Alamo Hall, which had deteriorated and was leaking and otherwise damaged. The appearance matches the previous, another in-kind replacement. And here you can see the previous damaged roof compared to the new. This spring, we removed the top portion of the Alamo Research Center porch roof from the red line and above. I'll try to use this pointer so from here. These concrete rafters were failing and cracked, posing a public safety hazard. And you can see by the photo at the right that we replaced it in kind to match the historic. The clay tiles were salvaged and reinstalled as part of the project. And here you can see the new porch roof being poured and the clay tiles being reinstalled after the concrete cured. We had a hard time replicating the concrete texture on the bottom side of the deck and rafters. The first try had a very distinct hole appearance, so the contractor went over it and over it to smooth that out. You can see the smoothing out in the image at the right. And here's the before and after showing the area of the most concerning damage. This is an image of the Gift Museum at the main south entry. And none of the stairwells in the Gift Museum were fire rated, so we needed to replace the historic doors and make other changes to create a 1-hour fire rating for safe egress and emergency. Instead of putting in off-the-shelf doors that were not appropriate, we fabricated new doors to match the old, but that had a 1-hour fire rating. At left is the before door, and at right is the after. We also had to close up a dumbwaiter that ran between the second and basement floors of the building and remove a window between the office and a stairwell. The Gift Museum basement had been getting water for at least a decade, and we worked on this issue this past winter, spring, and summer to figure out all of the various causes and to fix them. The project was completed last month. Shown here is a problem discovered last year where the French drain ends and then restarts, leaving a section where water could not move to the sump pump. As part of this project, we pulled all vegetation and irrigation out from around the building and installed gravel over a moisture barrier instead. And this will keep moisture away from the building and has a cleaner appearance. We also just completed renovation of the public restrooms. No public restroom on the Alamo Complex met ADA requirements, so we renovated both the women's and men's restroom to accommodate ADA requirements and to improve the finishes and fixtures, all of which were very tired, to say the least. We know that the restrooms are undersized and that more facilities are needed. This is just an interim measure, until the master plan helps us determine the best place to put more and better visitor accommodations. And Allison Chambers is our architect on this project and is here with us today. You can see here just how bad the flooring and how odd the paint job was. Here's the men's room before, during, and after. The concrete block wing wall had to be removed and replaced with a partition panel in order to meet ADA. The arcade, built in the 1930s on the south side of the church and used to queue up visitors into the church on heavy visitation days, had such deteriorated beams that some had to be removed this spring to eliminate potential failure. Now, as of this week, Thursday, all beams have been replaced with new cedar beams, and here you can see the work in progress with each beam coated for longevity. Last summer and fall, we had an arborist trim trees across the Alamo Complex and remove an invasive tree. The limbs were growing and resting in all the wrong places. In the case of Alamo Research Center, 2 limbs were resting on the building and were removed as part of this project, and you can see those at the red arrows. Large overgrown shrubs were removed from the north wall of this building as well. It's never a good idea to have vegetation growing so close to this building, and this also cleans up the appearance quite a bit. Oh, I was supposed to flip earlier. Okay, now on to completed research and condition assessment projects. One such project is a report on the history of the development of the Alamo Complex as a historic site, beginning with the purchase of the church in 1883. This helps us understand when and why certain choices were made and how the area changed from a mix of commercial buildings and businesses into a historic site and garden. You can see some of these features under demolition or construction. The red arrows again point to the front of the church to help you get your bearings. At left is the courtyard between the church and the long barrack prior to the planting of what is now the giant live oak. And you can see that here. And in the middle is demolition of the buildings behind the church, and at right is excavation for construction of what we now interpret as the acequia. We had an architect and engineer take a comprehensive look at the Gallagher Building, which is suffering from a rising damp problem, and this is where moisture rises from the ground into the building's walls and causes damage. The Gallagher Building is used as administrative offices. It's across Houston Street from the Alamo Complex. In the Gallagher, we could see the rising damp problem through paint damage. And you could see some of the other problems identified by the architect, Chris Hudson. We also had an assessment of the public areas of the Alamo Complex for ADA compliance. You can see here some of the identified problems, some of which we've already fixed, including the water fountains at the public restrooms, and others that we're working on, including door hardware at the Alamo Research Center. There are some areas of non-compliance that cannot be remedied without destroying historic fabric. So we're weighing these issues before proceeding. And one of those is shown here where you've got these archways that don't quite meet current code. We also completed an assessment of all of the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems across the Alamo Complex, finding many alarming deficiencies. And here are just a few pages from that report showing mechanical system issues on the Gift Museum. We'll be working to remedy identified deficiencies within the next year. So those are the completed projects that I wanted to share with you, and now on to the ongoing projects. The historic structure reports are documents that collect the full developmental history of a building or resource, discuss its context, assess its current condition, and make recommendations for future treatment. We're currently wrapping up a nearly year-long process for historic structure reports for the church in Long Barrack. Chris's firm is working on this and will go into much greater detail, but I want to mention that they've done a great job of compiling loads of information all in one place for the first time. And you can see here some of the Long Barrack's history, from a two-story commercial structure in the top image to a single ruined two-story wall in the bottom image to a roofless one-story building at the top. The Long Barrack was a two-story convento, or priest quarters, which we talked about, and was roofed as a one-story building only since the 1960s. We are also currently underway on a rehabilitation of the Alamo Research Center after the daughters moved out this summer. The central part of the building is from 1950 with 1970s additions. Non-historic partition walls are being demolished and a vault expanded and new finishes installed. The exterior has been cleaned, and you can see the difference on the masonry before and after here. Here's the interior of the central 1950 building, facing the front door on the west wall with a before image at the top and the work in progress shown in the other images. This room will be adaptively rehabilitated into a temporary exhibit space open to the public. It will have new flooring, lighting, and paint with hazardous materials abated and security precautions constructed. We'll open with an exhibit on Bowie knives this winter. We're also removing paneling, carpeting, and non-historic partition walls in the 1970s additions to improve office space and expand curatorial storage. You can see that the paneling is coming out of the 1970s areas at left and center. The roof is also being replaced, and you can see at the upper right how it collected water prior to replacement. The adjacent Alamo Hall, which is internally connected, didn't have an ADA compliant restroom, so we're inserting a unisex restroom in what was a chair storage room. And you can see that progress here. The plumbing is being brought in from the women's restroom, which is being renovated and will also have an ADA compliant stall. The portions of the project within Alamo Hall will be completed by the end of this month. We're getting ready to demolish the greenhouse in the employee area of the Alamo Complex, an incompatible audio tour shed located at the arcade, and some non-working ballpark type lights this November. The greenhouse is no longer used, and the failing glass panels pose a safety risk to staff, so it's going to be replaced with a simple storage shed that will prove more useful to current needs. Once the historic structure report is completed and the first draft of the master plan completed this fall, we'll have some direction on how best to address long-standing deficiencies in and on the church, including the mechanical system and window and stone deterioration. We look forward to taking the next steps to address these problems, as well as removing the incompatible reception desk within the next year. And as I mentioned on the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing report slide, we're getting ready to address these problems as well as grounds problems in a combined project within the next year. The grounds problems include grading that directs water towards sidewalks and buildings, trip hazards, and mismatched site furniture. I was asked to show a few images of the master plan archaeology, so let's do that now. To be clear, the master plan is not within the deferred maintenance program, but I'm involved as a member of the Alamo Master Plan Management Committee. We completed archaeological investigations at 2 areas this summer, shown at the red arrows. The purpose of the investigations was to determine the exact location of the original mission boundary walls. And these 2 investigation locations were selected because they were most likely to contain portions of the original walls, create the least disturbance to traffic, and not likely to contain human remains. Here's the investigation at the West Mission Wall, located in the Paseo between Alamo Plaza and the hotel. The archaeologists were accessible to the public through daily briefings outside of the protected fencing, which you can still find on Facebook and YouTube. In total, 16 1-by-1 meter square holes were dug by archaeologists after the paving surface was removed. The image at the right shows a 1 meter unit dug by the archaeologists, which reveals an adobe wall at the right side. Adobe or mud brick walls would have made up the mission walls. In addition to discovering the location of the adobe walls, archaeologists retrieved artifacts from the investigations, including a broken tip of a sword from the South Wall investigation shown at left. This sword tip is believed to have been owned by a Mexican infantryman. At right are images of pottery removed from the investigations, including pearlware from the early 19th century and Goliad and Valero ware from the 18th century. The archaeologists are now in the lab conserving artifacts and compiling data into a written report, and we'll hear more about the master plan later this afternoon from George Scarmeas. Just to circle back to the deferred maintenance program for a second, here are the firms that were or are under contract with GLO on the projects that I've talked about. We appreciate everything they've done to preserve and protect the Alamo Complex. So that's it for me. I'll pass it on to Mark Lambert to introduce Chris Hudson, and thank you for your interest.
We'll delay any questions till the end of all 3 speakers. Our next speaker is Chris Hutson, principal with Hutson Gallagher. Chris is a restoration architect with 27 years of experience working on historic buildings and structures throughout Texas. He has broad experience in building assessments, material conservation practices, programming, design, and construction contract management, and he has worked on various projects on the Alamo Complex since 2014. He is a partner with Hutson Gallagher. Let us welcome Chris Hudson. Thank you.
Hopefully the water will stay there. Well, it's certainly an honor to be selected to do this report, this historic structure report for the Alamo and the Long Barrack, but I am merely one small part of a very large team. And we have some very talented engineers, conservators, and material scientists that have done a lot, and historians, don't want to leave out the historians. They've done a lot of the bulk legwork on this project, so I would be certainly remiss coming up here and taking credit for any of that. It is also a work in progress, so the final recommendations are still in formation. So I just wanted to let you know that. We're scheduled to be complete probably in October, if everything goes well. The focus of a historic structures report differs a little bit from a master plan in that there is more of an effort to compile and understand the history of the buildings. And for this project, certainly there's 300 years of history, and some people have dedicated entire careers almost to studying this building. So, we're looking at it really at a very short period of time, but the idea is to leave the GLO with a document that they can use to sort of plan future work at the Alamo, and also to try to understand what are some of the key mechanisms that are affecting it right now. The decision was also made to do a separate report for the Long Barrack, and I have a special place in my heart for the Long Barrack. It is frequently sort of left out of the conversation, but it is a very important, is the sole surviving piece of the original convent. And, the history of the Long Barrack sort of diverges from that of the church after it was sold in 1877 to Honore Grenet, who used it as a wholesale warehouse and liquor storage. And he modified the building substantially by putting the balcony on it that you have seen in the photographs, and by extending it to the east. And it was really, the Long Barrack is really what I think of not as the birth of preservation, the preservation movement in Texas, but it's sort of where preservation really learned to walk. Because in 1870, the building was sold to Hugo and Smeltzer, and eventually came into the hands of Clara Driscoll, who sold it to the state of Texas. But what happened after that really sort of set the stage for preservation in Texas for many years. And this was something that played out, much like today, it played out in the newspapers and was the topic of conversation among many of the households. And Governor Colquitt himself intervened, came down to the site with his architect, and made decisions about the restoration of the building. So the Long Barrack is very special. Part of the research that we're doing involved visiting either online or in person quite a few institutions, many of them here in San Antonio. Some of them the historians thought had not been sufficiently delved into, such as the National Archives in Washington, D.C. So there was a lot of primary research that was done for this project. And, one of the things as an architect, when starting a project like this, that has been discussed by many people for many, many years, is to stay out of the weeds. But let me tell you, as soon as you start a project like this, you are in the weeds. So this very interesting drawing from the McNay by Seth Eastman, who was he was a West Point graduate. He actually wrote the book on topography at West Point, but he was also a very talented artist, and he visited the site in 1848. But even sort of drawings like this become, let's see if I get it right, these sort of become areas of question. His drawing shows the door on the south side of the transept. Other drawings don't. There's question as to whether these are actually what we call putt-log holes, which are holes that were left over from scaffolding. They appear sort of more regular on other drawings. Here they're a little bit more irregular. So, there's continued debate on exactly what those are. And then, there's debate on what exactly he was trying to show here. Is this a buttress? Is this just some broken area of stucco on the adjacent wall? So immediately in doing this project, you're sort of at that level of trying to understand what you're looking at. There's also a lot of historic photographs. The earliest, of course, is the 1849 daguerreotype which I believe is at the Briscoe. There's some very well-known photographs. This one at the Whitty showing the Alamo. But there's also some lesser-known photographs. This is sort of the upper west balcony of Hugo Smeltzer. And we studied both of these, or a lot of historic photographs, but looking at them from an architectural perspective and trying to understand what clues there are in the photographs that sort of tell us about the building, such as the step here at the second floor that allows entrance into the little rooms, the fact that the entire building was stuccoed at one point, the little fan light over the entry door changes from year to year, so it's kind of interesting to watch that. But as part of our project, we're trying to compile all of those photographs and put them into some sort of sequential order into a database that can be used by the GLO to make planning decisions. And so this is sort of two different formats, sort of a abbreviated format and sort of an extended format of what that database would look like. And an interesting side note, just because I like side notes, this is it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but somebody showed this to me and they said, well, what are these funny little chimneys on top of the Alamo? Were there actual fireplaces in there? And, you know, I did some research in conjunction with the historians, and it's kind of an interesting story. There's an article in 1875 that says that there was a fire in San Antonio that greatly endangered the Alamo. And what I believe these to be, after looking at the photographs, are actual, what we call fire barrels that were put up on the roof in an effort to preserve the building in a fire. The idea being that a barrel full of water up on the roof during a fire, the local citizens would shoot it out and the water would drain over the wood shingle roof and help put out the fire. It was frequently used on sawmills and train depots and similar things, but they didn't last long, probably because nobody wanted to go up there and check to make sure the barrels were filled, and probably having the citizens shoot at the building during a fire was not a good thing. So anyway, I always liked that photo. That's one of my favorites. The other thing that we're trying to do is to take some of these photographs and understand what we're looking at, what historic material is still on the building today. This is one example of some of that. Most people don't realize it, but as the church was being built, there were different building campaigns over the years. There were actually 5 separate master masons that worked on this at various times. This, from about 1762, we believe, this wall was installed. This is one of the earliest photographs we have of it. So we're trying to compare photographs like this to the wall as it exists today and find where the similarities are. So, you know, these stones, we believe, are remnants, are the same stones that were installed, that were in place in the 1870s. This door was expanded when the building was, when the Hugo and Smeltzer had the building next door. There's still a recess there, but portions of this wall date back very far. The other thing that we're trying to sequence together to help understand the building is to compare different photographs. These are 2 from the DRT library, and it sort of becomes like the Sunday morning comic of finding the differences. And you may not be able to see it, but there's sort of a long gash in the wall here that had been there for many years, and all of a sudden it gets repaired. And there's a similar gash up at the top of the parapet that suddenly gets repaired. So but for some reason they didn't bother, you know, coming in down here and doing repairs. It was just that gash and then up there. Well, this helps us understand sort of and looking at those areas now, when repairs were made to them, why they were made, and by comparing the photographs, we can kind of put a date on it because we know this flagpole was not here before 1920. So part of our job is condition assessment, and so I just wanted to talk about that briefly. These are all photographs from the Long Barrack. The one on the left shows some very severe spalling on the east side of the building. And it's been happening, whoops, I'll get ahead of myself. This spalling is about 3 inches deep. Part of the problem is that after 1910, after 1900, but specifically after 1910, masons started to use significant amounts of Portland cement in the mortars. Portland cement is very dense. It has a tendency to trap moisture in it. And so what happens is this Portland cement mortar traps the moisture, and then it can only evaporate through the stone itself. And the mortar on this is so bad that it's almost like a stucco. It's covering the faces of the stone. There's also quite a few iron anchors that remain in the building. When iron rusts, it swells, and the pressures from that crack the stone. This is on the west side of the building in one of the window recesses. There's also quite a lot of erosion of original stone at the base of the building. This is also along the east side, and this mortar was patched, I believe, in the 1990s. Part of the problem is the hardscape around the building. The sidewalks themselves promote splash during heavy rains that sort of increases the amount of water flowing over these stones. So particularly along the bottom of the building, there's quite a lot of erosion happening, especially in locations where there's very hard surfaces. Other locations, there's no mortar at all. There's, here's my pin stuck about 6 inches into a wall cavity on the west side. And that may just be natural deterioration of the mortar over time. You can see later repointing events have come on. This is probably 1960s era mortar, but they didn't really get to the heart of the problem, which was deeper inside the wall. So we are in the process of compiling all that information into a visual form in terms of drawings. So this is an example of the north side of the church with all of the conditions noted. Kim asked me to talk a little bit about some of the testing that we're doing. Obviously, the Alamo being a very important piece of Texas history, testing has to be done very carefully without damaging the historic fabric. And so I'm going to talk about 4 different tests that we've done on the building. 2 of them are completely non-destructive. The others, I've used the term minimally destructive, which is my term, because we did have to do a little bit of damage. The first is, sometimes the simplest ones are always the best. Currently, there's no real method in place to measure or quantify the damage that's happening on the interior. There is quite a bit of stone loss. It happens on a daily basis. And the maintenance staff every morning comes in and they dutifully clean the entire church. So we wanted to know how much mortar and stone is being lost. So it wasn't my idea, but it was a very good idea that the conservators came up with, was to stop cleaning. And it's kind of counterintuitive, but we decided that in the confessional and the baptistry to the right and the left of the entrance, that because they could be gated and therefore we could make sure that they were not cleaned, that we would just put down some simple black paper around the edge of the room for 3 months. And so that's what we did, and just to see what happened. And we got quite a bit of debris fall onto that paper. Here you can see it there, and there's a piece, this is a 2-inch piece that fell off the wall in 3 months. So it's a very simple test, but it can at least give us an idea of how much material is being lost on a regular basis. So we were then able to take those samples and weigh them and then come up with sort of a material loss for that wall over time. I think it ended up being, it was like 120 grams over the 3 months. Another very, very simple test that is also non-destructive that we were able to do It's been around since the 1980s. It's called a Rylem tube test, and I won't embarrass myself by trying to pronounce the French name that Rylem is an abbreviation of, but it's a simple test that just puts a clear sort of graduated cylinder of water against either the stone or the mortar, and then measures how long it takes water to absorb into the masonry. It's a very simple test. It can be done easily with just the little tube and some putty against the wall. But it gives some interesting results. The conservator on our team measured different mortars and compared them to the stone. And for historic buildings, you always want the mortar to be at least as permeable as the stone. Because if it's not, then water transfer happens through the stone and not through the mortar. So this is kind of interesting in that this line down here sort of represents the baseline for the stone. And two of the mortars, one from the 1980s and I think that's the 1990s, are very close to it in terms of permeability. But then even some of the recent mortars are much, much more permeable, including one that dates back to the 1960s. The third sort of testing that we did, and I'm calling this minimally destructive testing, is the use of ground penetrating radar. And for those of you who know, GPR is used primarily to locate things underground, such as burial sites and remnants of historic structures. But we were using it a little bit differently in that we wanted to look at the walls of the Alamo to find out if there are significant voids in them. The walls of the Alamo were built with very few bond stones, so there's not stones that go from one side of the wall to the other. There's simply stones on one side, stones on the other, and sort of a rubble fill in the middle. So the idea was to use GPR to scan areas that we were concerned about because they were bulging slightly and determine if there were in fact voids behind them. So it involved both interior and exterior scanning using a variety of scanners, different frequencies to give us varied results. But the problem is that these results really take some interpretation. So you have to corroborate that kind of data with some actual real-world eyes-on data. So we decided to go ahead and boroscope the locations where the test data found that there might be voids. And so this is a very, very small hole that was drilled. And again, we didn't go through the stone, we went through the mortar because the mortar is replaceable. We did drill very small holes in locations where the GPR testing said there might be voids, and they were able to confirm the presence of voids in several locations. We always try to save even the smallest things because they might be useful. And so even the debris from drilling out the mortar was analyzed to determine what the initial aggregates were. And we have some ideas of what the original Spanish colonial mortars were, what the Army mortars were. So even sort of the debris that came out of these holes was analyzed and used. And part of the things that the engineer, or some of the things that the engineer discovered in addition to the voids was that there are some significant cracking in portions of the sacristy. And for that reason, particularly on the north end of the sacristy, which has been cut off, the ceiling vault has been cut off. So for that reason, we recommended closing off this area to the public, at least the north section of this area to the public. And the final thing, again, that is minimally destructive, was to actually take some small samples of stone and have them analyzed through scanning electron microscopes and look at their salt content and try to understand the processes that are causing their deterioration. And we sampled, I think it was 27 areas inside the church, and 6 at the Long Barrack. Again, we tried to pick samples that would cause the least amount of destruction. So here's a little piece on the church. It's just about to fall off on its own. And so that was selected as one of the sample locations. And part of the microscopy was to determine the salt contents of the stone. And historic masonry, and limestone in particular, is very porous, and water moves through it at a fairly quick rate. But that water picks up all sorts of things on its path. And the most dangerous of those are what we call soluble salts. Those can be sulfates, nitrates, chlorides. And it is those salts that are causing significant amounts of the damage, because when the water evaporates through the wall, the salts stay behind. Well, salt in solution is not really a problem, but when it crystallizes, it produces stresses on that stone. And those stresses cause that stone to spall. And so I know you can't read this, but I'll try to read it for you. I only got this earlier this week, so I haven't really digested it myself. But in addition to the samples that were collected on the church, we also sampled the little pieces that were saved when we put the black paper down. And so the material scientist says, for the sample to be considered salt-laden, and the dangerous level of salt is 1,500 parts per million. The 4 samples, or the 6 samples that came off of the little test where we put down the black paper, the lowest parts per million total dissolved solids was over 8,200. So 8,200 to over 12,000, when anything over 1,500 is considered severe. So Kim hasn't even seen this data yet. I just got it this week. So interestingly, the Long Barrack, all of the samples tested extremely low for salt, and that may explain why rising damp is less of a problem at the Long Barrack compared to the Alamo. And so, like I said, we are still sort of formulating our recommendations, both from an architectural standpoint, from a structural standpoint, looking at the mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems currently within the building. We hope to finish this in October, but once again, I am part of a very large team looking at this building, and I think that part of the path of understanding and monitoring the deterioration of the stone needs to happen on a much more regular basis, because we just sort of come in and look at it at various points. And we really need a monitoring process that is permanent in nature, so that rather than looking at this thing every 5 or 10 years, we have data that's collected continuously over time. So anyway, I think that is the end of mine. Yes, thank you.
We'll leave the questions till the end. Our next speaker is Pamela Jary Rosser, the Conservator at the Alamo. Pam works at Alamo Complex Management. She has been a practicing conservator for over 25 years and specializes in Spanish colonial finishes. Previously, she was a partner with Restoration Associates Limited, where she conserved various exterior and interior finishes of historic buildings. She's a graduate of University of Incarnate Word and is a professional associate of the American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. She serves on the San Antonio World Heritage Advisory Committee as an event co-chair for the, I don't know what group that is, Pam, APT? Association of Preservation Technology, okay. and is a member of the Western Association for Art Conservation. Please help me in welcoming Pamela.
Hello. I'm going to talk about two items today. One is the conservation work that I've been doing at the Alamo consecutively for 6 years, and the other is how I have brought state-of-the-art technology into combining it with the conservation work. So let's step into, Okay. This is the exit door of the church, so we're going to stroll, I'm sorry, y'all. We're going to stroll into this room right here, which is the sacristy. Many people ask, what is my role as the Alamo Conservator? As a conservator, as any conservator, the purpose is to prevent the walls from decay. The slide on the left is an example of historic detached plaster. The slide on the right shows active salt formations, which is what Chris was just discussing. What steps are taken when these existing conditions are found? Regarding the active salts, one of the steps I take is, particularly with this one, is this salt is in a fluffy stage, as I call it. So I take a bristle brush and I very carefully dust it off into a marked bag and save it for analysis. Regarding the detached plaster, it's a very different process from that. It requires dampening the surface with distilled water, then applying edge stabilization and with a palette knife, followed by a coating of aquasporca. And aquasporca is just a lovely word, but it really is just dirty water that's mixed with an acrylic resin. And the purpose of that is to disguise the conservation treatment. So you can see here, this is where I've done edge stabilization because the plaster here was stable, maybe, but it had fallen away all of here. So I applied edge stabilization here, and then I went back and darkened it up here so it blends in better. So if you walk into the sacristy, you are not seeing all these weird little white snakes everywhere on the wall. Other conservation treatments that I do is, and this is based on a 1 foot square as I assess the walls, is I remove dirt and debris to reveal unknown frescoes and historic graffiti. I reattach pigment. I do documentation of the existing walls and conditions and findings. I apply hydraulic mortar injections where blind voids exist. I do weekly collections of temperature and relative humidity levels in the church and the long barracks, as well as the environment outside of those buildings. And I apply acrylic resin to stabilize any detached plaster or mortar. And I also harvest samples as needed for analysis. And it's just me doing all of that. So here is a wall sample of before. And when I talk about this before, what I'm meaning is before the year 2000, the known story was the Alamo was never decoratively painted because it never had a permanent roof. So it didn't look like the other 4 missions south of the Alamo. But when they opened up these side rooms and the Daughters of the Republic, their exhibit team was walking through, one of them looked up and noticed that there was a triangle painted on the wall. And very quickly, they managed to raise quite a bit of money and brought in Restoration Associates to start doing the additional investigation in the sacristy. And what we did was we removed 8 to 9 layers of U.S. Army whitewash by shaving each layer off. And we exposed the frescoes not only, on the middle part of the wall, but the top part of the wall and the lower part of the wall. And so starting in 2000, the known story that it wasn't decoratively painted changed, because it was decoratively painted, and it was very elaborately decoratively painted. And I'm going to share more of these findings using the state-of-the-art technology, which has really helped in my work. But you need to understand a fresco before we get into the guts of everything. The Alamo fresco technique is similar to the fresco technique, which was first perfected in Italy in 1300. The craftsmen, after layering the wall area with coarse plaster followed by smooth plaster, scribed vertical and horizontal incised lines which were used as a guide. A cartoon was then temporarily attached to the wall. The cartoon was made of a stretched, dried animal skin containing a charcoal drawing. The cartoon was temporarily placed on the surface, and I forgot. So the cartoon is drawn out, and then they take a piece of stone and they made tiny little perforations in the cartoon, and then it is then placed on the wall, temporarily attached. Then took a cloth that was filled with powdered pigment, and they very gently pounced it on the wall. When they removed the cartoon, you had these tiny little dots, and then the artist went back and then connected the dots, and then went back and then in-painted it with various tinted lime washes, and that's how you would get the different colors that you see in the sacristy. So this shows you at the top incised lines, and then the lower is the pouncing technique. So I've explained briefly the conservation efforts and the fresco process. Now let's discuss the non-destructive state-of-the-art technology combined with the conservation work in the sacristy. So we're still in the sacristy. In 2012, modern technology began analyzing pigments in the sacristy, utilizing a portable X-ray fluorescence. This device was chosen because of the accurate and on-site analysis. Also in 2012, we began using a second type of state-of-the-art technology, the multispectral imaging camera, which captures high-resolution detail images and later are stitched together. Both types of technology helps discover fresco designs and pigments which have faded into the plaster. This advanced technology was chosen because the historic surfaces remain unharmed. So first I'm going to go into more detail with the multispectral imaging, which I call MSI, but I'll probably just say multispectral. Multispectral imaging conducted from 2012 to 2014 has yielded much data. Questions still remain, primarily because the results are so much more intricate and sophisticated than we anticipated. The multispectral images has enabled me to add the faded design elements in a sketch and to see a pattern as it was originally. So if you look at the photograph, you can see how the frieze design, it sort of fades at the top. You can't see everything. But with the multispectral imaging, I am able to see how the frieze patterns, there's two patterns and how they connect to each other and flowing on the wall. The east and south wall of the sacristy has a lovely oval design that's painted in yellow ochre. the use of the multispectral images has helped determine the intricate detail of the oval frame. When you look at the oval frame today, you could really just faintly see a yellow ochre oval, and it just looks like a very plain Jane frame. But with the multispectral image, there is quite a lot of detail that went into that oval design. This, one of the best parts. Okay. Using a UV light and the multispectral camera, a floral motif was discovered on the upper east, west, and south walls of the sacristy. I get so excited when I see this because you can't see this unless you have a UV light. The fresco has completely faded into the plaster on all three of those walls. And so we currently are working on this area again to determine more information about this floral motif. The image on the left is the frieze band, which goes around the perimeter of the sacristy, which I showed you a few slides back. Now imagine the frieze with that drawing on top of it. That will give you an idea of how elaborate the patterns were laid out on the walls. And currently there's multispectral imaging work being done in the sacristy for the next few weeks. So if you have time, you might pop in there and ask them questions. It's very fascinating. This is also part of the multispectral imaging. The wainscot is also currently under investigation. When you look at the photograph on the top, you can tell there's some design elements that just sort of look like they're floating in no man's land. They need to somehow be attached to that design, or something needs to be added to it. So now we'll talk about the portable XRF, which I refer to it as the technical gun. As I mentioned earlier, the second type of modern technology used is a portable X-ray fluorescence. The portable XRF has identified unknown pigments, which has expanded the color palette used in the sacristy during the Spanish colonial era. It has identified the proteins utilized to make the tinted lime washes. These proteins are either goat's milk or cow's milk. And this modern technology has also developed a serendipity and collaborative relationship with the Alamo and Trinity University. So Trinity University owns the gun, and then I call them, or they'll call me, and they'll want to come and do some work in the sacristy to help with this ongoing investigation, and I get the approval from the Alamo Complex management, which gets approval from the state, and it's just all a happy relationship. So, and they'll do it for free. So, so we're going to do a little analysis on the floral and pomegranate design, which is located at the top portion of the east, west, and south walls of the sacristy. So just pretend like you're there and Trinity's got their gun, and so we're going to sample an area on the wall. So the red seed of the pomegranate that you see at the top right consists of vermilion, which is a mineral found in Europe, not found in Texas and not found in Mexico. So from that, I can conclude that when the missionaries came over, they brought pigment with them. The yellow ochre and the red ochre of the flower and the outer edge of the pomegranate are minerals that are very common in the San Antonio area. The green earth of the leaves of the floral design that you see is also a common mineral found in San Antonio. The charcoal, obviously, the outline is from burned wood. And the copper green discovered in the center of the pomegranate, which has faded into the plaster, so you can't see it, is not common in this area. So it was either made on site or the craftsmen brought it with them. Each of these minerals were mixed individually with a protein and calcium carbonate, creating a beautiful tinted lime wash. Now, if they didn't bring the copper green with them, they would have had to make it on site. So that meant they would have had to have brought copper with the copper metal with them. And this technique dates back for many centuries. And the technique is this, is you have a I call it a Siamese vase. So you have two vases that are attached. One is filled with either animal urine or vinegar, and the other one contains copper sheeting or wires. They then encapsulate the entire vase with animal dung. They then bury it in the ground and cover it and leave it there for about 48 or 72 hours. Dig it up, remove the animal dung, pull out the copper, and you have that lovely patina, and they then would brush it off into a bowl, and then they would mix it with their protein and calcium carbonate, and there they had their copper tinted lime wash. Oh, I didn't know they did that. Okay. Here you can see a graph of the portable XRF analysis and the results showing the peaks of this specific element. This graph shows the high peaks of the copper, which I just discussed, concluding the center of the pomegranate was painted with copper-tinted lime wash during the Spanish colonial era. You can also see copper-tinted lime wash, which is currently invisible. But you can see when we would use the gun, let's say this is the wall, we'd put the gun up here, and then the gun is connected to a laptop, and so the results show immediately. So we see this graph, and where you see those two peaks, that's confirming that we've found the copper pigment. Very exciting. Okay. So while we're working on site with Trinity, they do sketches that are made from the analysis and the discoveries, which are invisible. And so we're doing a sketch as we are doing the analysis on each wall, and then we end up with making these types of designs. And so just kind of look at that. You saw the UV black and white image of that floral motif, but you can see there's something happening at the end of them, right? You kind of see that? Okay. So here, for example, the multispectral imaging shown here, which is the design of the floral motif, has only visible stems and leaves, but the portable XRF has found flowers at the end of the stems. Currently, this area is under investigation, and not all the flower shapes and the colors have been concluded, which is exciting because we just found these flowers at the end of the stems just, I guess, a year ago. And so now the multispectral work is there, and his purpose is to determine, okay, there you go. So the darker image is the UV image, and then all those little squares, that is where we have done portable XRF analysis. But because at the end of each stem, the floral motif, the stem and the leaves are all copper pigment and green earth, but then at the end of each stem we started to get various colors, whether they contained lead or mercury. But we weren't able to, with the portable XRF, we were not able to determine what the shapes are, and so that is what the multispectral imaging will hopefully be able to determine what the shapes are at the end of each stem. We're thinking, Trinity thinks the top one is a lily, but the verdict is still out on that. Okay, this is also so exciting. The combined advanced technology discovered copper leaf band, which went around the perimeter of the sacristy. To date, the Alamo is the only San Antonio mission with this type of decorative finish. We also found copper leaf in the doorway of the confessional at the Alamo. So we just happened to come across this because we were taking the UV light and just waving it on the wall, and all of a sudden we saw these streaks that were just like on the south, east, and west wall. And then I got my portable microscope, which it looks like kind of if you're doing a sonogram. And I was doing that, had it on the wall, and when I put it on the wall, then I found a very sparkly, lovely color, and with the portable XRF, we analyzed it, and it identified itself as copper. And so we were able to conclude that all of these areas were copper leaf. making the sacristy this beautiful and elaborate room. The arrow located on the right CAD drawing identifies the location of the copper leaf band, which I just showed you. We don't know very much about the band, if it's a solid band or if it's ornate. There's still a lot of investigation work to do there. But I want you to take a moment and compare the two CAD drawings. You can see the one that says CAD 2000, or the discoveries we found in the year 2000, and then the CAD 2016 are the recent discoveries made with combining traditional conservation treatments and state-of-the-art technology. It's very exciting. We've found quite a bit in just this one room. All of these details will one day add to the story of the Alamo. I hope you will share this exciting discoveries with others. If you saw a design that you recognize, please let me know. I'm always doing research because I have many questions. I'm not only here to preserve the Alamo, but I'm also here to share these interesting discoveries. Thank you.
We do have time for a few questions. If you have them for any of the three speakers, it's 2:21, so plenty of time for questions. 9 minutes, in fact.
Thank you, Pamela. I wanted to tell you thank you very, very much for what you're doing. I was wondering what is going to be done with the drawings and the color that you all are discovering. Are you going to be able to put something on display for the public to see?
So you asked what will happen with all these drawings and findings, and will they be put on display? And the answer is that the master team will work on all of that and make the final decision.
Recognizing a theme on answers.
Pam, don't go away. I just want to know if, is there some computer access that we can have to this so we can keep up with what you're finding?
That is a fabulous idea. That would then be a question to, I guess, talk to the master plan, the GLO. That's a great idea.
This also has to do with the paintings, and I'm wondering if you could date them and how far back they went. Were they done when the Alamo was built, or at some point thereafter? And do they relate to some of the other missions or some of the other buildings that were built around that time? Or have you done any of that kind of research?
That's a good question. I do know that the period that they were painted in was probably in, I would say probably 1740s, 50s, or let's say 30s to 50s. And their color palette is very similar to the work I've done at Mission Concepcion and Mission San Jose, and the painting technique is very similar. So I can tie that, since they're sister missions, that they probably use the same art craftsmen at the Alamo and Concepcion and at San Jose.
Question over here.
I was just going to ask if the PowerPoints would be available that we've seen in the last hour.
They asked about PowerPoints. Is it going to be, you want to answer that?
We are filming all of these, so that will be available one day via YouTube. The PowerPoints themselves, we have not planned to make those available yet. I guess we'd have to talk to each individual speaker to do that.
Some of the images are from different archives, so we would have to get permission to distribute those. Some of the images in that PowerPoint are from various archives, local and elsewhere. So to distribute them publicly, we'd have to get permission from each one of those archives. So that was my only response.
Got a question right here.
The main question I had is we keep getting referred to, well, we'll know that better when we get to the master plan, which is sort of creating some frustration, rather subdued, I think. But anyway, is there any way that progress steps on this master plan, putting it together, or the proceedings of the committees or whatever, will that be available in any form, either online or whatever, or do we have to come down and attend the meetings? Heaven forfend.
Well, meetings are fun.
We've had one public meeting for the master plan at this point, and we plan to do a second. We'll be figuring out the date of that second public meeting by the end of this month, and we'll make that available. Those meetings are webcast, so you don't actually have to be there in person. And we do have a website for the master plan where you can keep track of updates. And that, George, can you help me with the name of the website for the master plan? Okay, we're going to get you an update with that master plan website. I'll look at it on my phone and I'll come right back and tell you.
Yeah, I have a suggestion and a question. The suggestion, I think one of you mentioned that there's going to be an exhibit of the Bowie knives. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
I wanted to suggest that there's a gentleman in South Texas who has Bowie knives, a whole collection of them that were made about 40 years before James Bowie invented it, that I want to be able to talk to you about.
Okay, yeah, that exhibit is being designed by GLO staff. Mark Lambert would be happy to talk with you about that.
Good. I'll talk to you guys. And then the question that I had was, obviously it's very impressive. It's exciting, the work that you're doing to identify and to preserve, to examine and preserve the built environment around the Alamo and Plaza. My question is, are you paying that much attention to the landscape, to the outside? Primarily because the mission to a Spaniard, the mission was not the building. In fact, I noticed we call it the church. It wasn't a church. For a mission, they didn't have a church. What they had was a chapel for the Europeans. But the mission itself was the Indians, who usually were out in front. And so where did they build their campfires? Where were their huts, their jacales? Where were their burial grounds? The natives themselves, the real people of the mission, were really outside the building. And I'm just wondering, do we have a lot to preserve the trees? You have an anacua tree in the backyard, in the courtyard of the Alamo, which is critical to them. You have those flowering anaquita trees that they also preserved. You have the acequias that were critical to them. And so I'm just wondering, do you put as much attention into the dirt, into the landscape, examining and preserving that part of the life as you do the buildings?
That's a great point and question, and definitely something we have to be doing more and better in the future, and that will be part of the master plan. We haven't had a role in the deferred maintenance program on working on a cultural landscape, but the master plan has specialists in cultural landscapes and heritage landscapes involved in their process. They're currently at the phase of documentation and investigation. We'll be seeing this fall them come into more of a design solution. We'll have a draft of that master plan in December, and they'll be doing more investigation to solidify that that plan and make sure that it accomplishes everything that it needs to accomplish. But definitely we're going to be looking into the landscape in a way that we haven't before.
Yeah, just a quick question for Pam Rosser on all that wonderful fresco work. Presumably, that's all done within a space that has a roof on it, right? Is that all in the sacristy? Was there any fresco in the church, and do we have any conclusions about a roof there?
Where are you? Oh, you're right there. Okay. Hi. That's a great question, and the answer is yes and yes. So yes, all the images I showed you all are all the sacristy, but I have also found fragments and some design elements in the nave and the transept of the Alamo, as well as the copper leaf, as I mentioned, above the doorway, or in the doorway of the confessional. I haven't started any conservation work in the baptismal, so there's still yet discovery there. And I haven't done all the work in the main part of the Alamo, meaning the certain walls of the transept or the chancel part. So there's still more discovery. But from what I found, I can conclude that the entire interior of the Alamo was decoratively painted.
Website for the Alamo Master Plan is called reimaginethealamo.org. reimaginethealamo.org. And my name is Kim Barker. I work for the Land Office, and you're welcome to email me at any time. And it's kim.barker@glo.texas.gov.
All right, can we thank again our three speakers?